Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you. To another episode of Dis Affamie History Podcast, where we uncover the stories, people, and the archives that shape our understanding of Caribbean history and genealogy. I'm your host, Wendy Aris, and today I'm delighted to welcome back a returning guest, Associate Professor Kathrine Gerbner. If you've heard our previous conversation, you'll know that Kathrine has an extraordinary ability to shed light on the complex religious and cultural histories of the Atlantic world. It's a pleasure to have her back on the podcast to discuss her compelling new book, Archival Irruptions. In this episode, we explore how archives are far more than collections of documents. They are living spaces where power, memory, resistance, and forgotten voices intersects. Kathrine challenges us to think differently about the historical record and to ask new questions of the sources we often take for granted. Our conversation focuses on the Moravian Church, its extensive archival legacy throughout the Caribbean, and what those records reveal and conceal about the lives of enslaved Africans and their descendants. We also delve into the complex subject of Obia, examining how colonial authorities and missionaries documented African spiritual practices and how historians can read beyond those narratives to recover the perspectives and experiences of the people whose voices were often marginalized or omitted. Together, we discuss what it means to read against the grain of the archives, why archival silences matter, and how unexpected discoveries, or what Kathrine likes to call it, archival eruptions, can transform our understanding of Caribbean history, religion, and the African diaspora. Whether you're a genealogist, historian, archivist, student, or simply someone passionate about uncovering the untold stories of the past, this conversation will encourage you to see archives in an entirely different light. So let's settle in as we welcome back Associate Professor Kathrine Gerbner for an insightful discussion on archival interruptions, the Moravian Church, Obia, and the hidden histories waiting to be uncovered within the archives. So let's have a listen. I wanted to thank you so much, Professor Gerbner, for coming back onto the podcast this season 9 to talk about your book, Archival Irruptions. And this was in regards to talking about Obeah and, of course, the Moravian Church and how just they're kind of interconnected in terms of how that whole situation between enslaved Africans and the Moravian Church. Now, before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself in case people didn't listen to your previous episode in season 8? That would be greatly appreciated. Thanks.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me on again. My name is Kathrine Gerbner, and I am a professor of history at the University of Minnesota. And my first book was Christian Slavery, which we talked about on the last podcast. And this new book, which came out in 2025, is Archival Eruptions. And yes, as you mentioned, this is about Obia, which I think is a very difficult and misunderstood topic.
No, absolutely. And we'll start with that. In December of 1760, Obia became formally criminalized in Jamaica. What was happening in that moment that pushed colonial legislators to codify Obia as a crime?
Yeah, this is a key point, and the simple answer is Tacky's Revolt, the largest slave rebellion in the entire 18th century British Empire, which broke out in Jamaica in 1760, and it spread across much of the island and took a very long time to be put down by the colonial authorities. And so in December of 1760, the colonial legislators met to talk about how they were going to respond to this uprising. And they created a new act against what they called irregular assemblies. And this did many things, but the part of it that I think is just really important to focus on is the part that it is responding to Obeah specifically. And so what they did, this was the first time that Obeah was ever mentioned in British colonial law. And what they did is they said that this was an illegal act, a criminal activity, that it would be sentenced by either transportation or execution. And they talked about how Obeah men and women basically were aiding the rebellion, right? And they compared them to witches. They criminalized a number of different material objects that they said were associated with the practice of Obeah. But yeah, so I think it's very important to emphasize that Obeah became a crime specifically because of this massive uprising of enslaved people in 1760.
And then you as well in your book, you mentioned or you argued that that slave-owning legislators essentially waged war on anything that was African sources of power. What made Obia such a central target?
Yes, I think that because this is the context of trying to basically control the enslaved population, they are they're trying everything, right? They are meting out just horrendous punishments to enslaved rebels, but they're also trying to think more broadly about, where are the rebels gaining their sense of solidarity with each other, the courage to do something that is really probably a suicide attempt, right? To actually rise up against enslavers in this extremely oppressive colonial environment of 18th century Jamaica. And so they, in my mind, see Obia as a way in which enslaved and freed Africans were sort of binding themselves together, creating sacred communities, and these are all the building blocks of rebellion, but also community belonging. This is the
Mm,
rebellion, the sort of the. It can also be sort of the centerpiece of it's religious the way religions binds people together, and this is how you create power by bringing people together under a common cause and through various rituals and practices. That's common throughout you know, religious traditions and also, creating nations and sort of larger political communities.
absolutely. And, Obia is still technically on the books as a crime in Jamaica today. What does that legal residue tell us about the long shadow of colonial religious politics?
It's really striking that it's still a crime. And, there have been efforts to decriminalize it in the past few years, and those have so far failed. And to me, it shows how lasting these sort of slavery era efforts to oppress certain peoples what an afterlife they have had. In a way, Obia has the meaning of Obia has shifted so dramatically, in even by the 19th century, but certainly by the 20th and now the 21st, that I think most people just associated with things that are bad and scary, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Across the board, so it's almost like a shorthand for things you shouldn't, be involved with. And that's not what it meant in, the 1750s. And so I think it's a really important thing to kind of go back into the historical record and try to reconstruct what these practices that were oppressed by the colonial state for the purpose of slave control, what they meant to people before those acts of criminalization. And I think that it's difficult work, but I think we can do it with very careful readings of the sources that we do have, and we should do that.
Yeah, and I think where I'm just gonna go my next question is basically, the term obeah has, of course, different names, meanings, and interpretations across time. How did 18th century Jamaicans understand obeah, and how did that differ from how colonial authorities defined it?
Yeah. So this is the key question, and I'll just tell you right up front what the major problem is, which are the sources that we have. So before 1760, so before it became a crime, there are really just a handful of sources in the archives that talk about Obia,
Mhm.
and all of them are written by English colonists, enslavers, visitors to the islands, ministers, and in all but the one that I focus on in my book, they are referencing Obeah as sort of a kind of witchcraft or conjuring. Sometimes they'll say it's something to do with, like maybe like a witch doctor kind of thing. So there is an allusion to some sort of healing mechanism within the practice. But for the most part, these are references to a practice that the Europeans view as, a, within this sort of framework of witchcraft. Now, that's, I think, not how many Africans and people of African descent viewed Obeah at the time. Witchcraft for Europeans is a way of attacking practices that they don't really understand or trying to control, or they don't control themselves. And so we have to, think really carefully about how to interpret the sources that have been left to us. So I started this project when I found a reference to Obeah in the Moravian missionary archives, which I'm sure we'll talk more about. In which the very first Moravian missionary to Jamaica says that the Africans and African descended people who are coming to his meetings called him Obeah. And then he defines it as sort of a seer, someone who knows things that are going to happen. And so it's like basically a prophet, right? So it's a very different way of understanding what this is. And so I sort of built an argument based on these records and reading all of those missionary records very carefully, and kind of triangulated various different references to show that, Obi, I think, for people who were practitioners, who were part of this community, first of all, it was more community focused, right? There are Obeah men and women, but I think that they are sort of the centerpieces that bring together a larger sacred community. Right. Second of all, I think it's really important to talk about the role of healing. So if you look at the ways in which this community that I am looking at, how I think they're understanding Obia, it's it it is a practice that can help people, right? So that can heal people, like literally, illness, etc. But also, metaphysically, like they talk about sort of the great physician, right? So I think there's a healing practice that's very much associated with it, and then of course there is the importance rituals that I think that should be associated with this idea of Obia. So water rituals in the case of the community I'm looking at, it's called baptism, but I think there are water rituals throughout the African diaspora. And then sort of the importance of Obia practitioners also as people who help to transition to the next world, right? So death, funerals, and so these really important life cycle transitions that we associate with religions, right? So and community practices. These were all, I think, part of this, we could call it the semantic field, right? The things that were associated with Obia in this time. So absolutely not sort of this black magic or witchcraft, right? But rather a sort of a community oriented practice in which, there were sort of experts, right? Obia men and women, but they were playing this central role in sort of creating the sacred community.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because a lot of these practices, people still do them today in the sense that, let's say, as an example, bush tea. That is, people use that as a healing process, and that's still being used even to today. And, we'll just go into the Maroon community leaders and how they engaged Obeah practitioners. What role did Obeah men and women play in resistance communities?
Yeah, so some of the very first records about Obia are referencing the Maroon communities in Jamaica. And there, again, you see that Obia is drawing the attention of English colonial writers, partly because it is being used as a form of resistance. And the colonial writers talk about, they refer to Nanny, who's this very famous Maroon leader, who as sort of this Obia woman, and she can do these things that seem impossible. And they explicitly sort of recognize that Obia is sort of empowering this sort of community of Maroons to resist the colonial state. And so again, just as in Tacky's revolt, it's seen as a dangerous practice and one that needs to be neutralized, right? To be or eliminated or at least sort of undercut. And so it's a very important part of the First Maroon War, and so continues to sort of play a role in maroon communities, but it's also in enslaved communities, as we see
Mhm.
in the records that I look at.
Okay. And, how did blood, healing, and of course, spiritual power function within African derived practices? And how did missionaries fixate on these elements?
So this is where I develop or sort of draw on this concept of spaces of correlation. And this was actually introduced by the art historian Cecile Froment, who studied Congo and West Central African encounters between Africans and Catholic missionaries. And her argument basically was that we need to look at these encounters at basically literally spaces of correlation, which means that there are overlapping ways of doing things, of having rituals that can mean slightly different things to practitioners. But so you come together and you have a communal ritual which has slightly different interpretations. And so I use this framework to talk about the Afro-Moravian community
Mhm.
in Jamaica in the 1750s, because I have sort of a chapter looking at sort of baptism, right? Of course, we know in Christian communities, baptism is a very important ritual, a cleansing ritual, also sort of a commitment to a religious community. There are also water rituals, right, within in African religious tradition. So this is something that can, you know, that can bring together people who are coming from different backgrounds, but then they co-create a ritual practice, and this is meaningful for all of the participants. And blood also is sort of one of these things. If we think of the communion, the meaning of Jesus's blood in Christian practice, which is very powerful, and especially for Moravians. Moravian theology focuses very much on the actual blood of Jesus and sort of the suffering that he went through and the sacrifice that he made. And so what does this, again, there are correlates in African religious traditions, and there's ways in which, I think that these ritual practices, we talk about them. They were living these, right? And so it's focusing on spaces of correlation is trying to bring us back into the actual material practice of the ritual rather than sort of the words that we would use to describe it. And so that's really the focus I try to have when I'm talking about these, right, the overlapping ways of making meaning in this Afro-Moravian slash Obeah community, right? Because I'm trying to, I think a lot of times we try to sort of draw the lines between these
Mhm.
religious practices, and I don't think that's how people at the time thought about it. I think that
Yeah.
they were not looking, aside from some of the missionaries I look at, they were not looking at policing boundaries in the way that I feel like we tend to when we're looking back at history.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, Professor Gerbner, you write about, again, these boundaries of religion being policed. How did Protestant Christianity become coded as legitimate religion while Obia was framed as criminal magic?
Yeah, such an important question. So, and this gets back to a little bit of my last book, the ways in which Christianity, and especially the Church of England in the British colonial lands, this was literally power was organized, along religious lines, parishes, vestry, right? Like there's
Mm.
sort of the church and the state were not separate in the way that we sort of perceive them to be now. And so the various churches, so Church of England is sort of the most legitimate, right? Because this is actually the state church. But then other Protestants churches, I mean, they are less legitimate than than the Anglican Church, but they sort of fight for legitimacy. There's a whole story about that.
Yeah.
The Moravian Church is sort of more marginal. So they are only granted the permission to go to British colonial lands in the 1740s. So this is just a few years after that, and they're very much sort of seen as weird outsiders. So they're Europeans, but they are still marginalized, and their church is a bit marginalized. And so there is a way in which the religion is being constructed on multiple levels. So you have the most legitimate with the Church of England and its connection to political power. Then you have sort of a spectrum, going sliding down, of increasingly illegitimate forms of religion, and Obeah is definitely at the bottom. And especially in 1760, right, as because it's seen as a dangerous practice that leads to rebellion, it is specifically targeted. And I think, to me, the name of the act that it is criminalized in, it's preventing the irregular assemblies.
Yeah.
It's trying to prevent people from coming together. And that is to me, that's religions, church practices are people coming together, but they're seeing, oh, but that could also be a rebellion. And so they are specifically trying to fully delegitimize Obia as a practice.
Absolutely. And of course, the Great Awakening and the rise of missionary activity really reshaped Jamaica's religious landscape. Beyond the Moravian Church, what other Protestant groups were active and what were their tendencies towards Obeah?
So the Moravian Church is really the first Protestant group to have Protestant denomination to have an active mission to Jamaica. So 1755. There have been other Protestant groups on the islands, but the Methodists, the Baptists, they really expand in the later part of the 18th century and into the 19th century. By that point, though, Obia and Christianity are seen as opposing ideas,
Yes.
right? So I think that there is, and even by the end of my book, mine is a micro history. I start in 1755 with the arrival of the first Moravian missionary, and I end in 1760 with the criminalization of Obia. Already by that point, that with the arrival of a new missionary who has different ideas about what's truly Christian, I see that Obia and Christianity are already being seen as, you know, as opposites, and that grows over time. So even in later Moravian records, uh, references to Obia there. It's seen as completely incompatible with Christian practice, and that's generally the case with sort of these American or European missionaries who arrive. And I think that this demonstrates really sort of how the effect, the
Mhm.
success of the criminalization, as well as the importance, I think, especially for more marginalized Protestant groups, to sort of not rock the boat too much, right? Like and sort of not integrate Obia into their practice.
Yeah, it's just one of those things. But you know, Professor Gerbner, the book is, the Moravian Church is central to your book. And
Mm.
how did the Moravian missionaries interpret African spiritual practices, especially around sickness and healing?
Yes, well, it depends on the missionary, really. So
Mm.
I because that this is one of the things again we tend, when we're looking at the past, we say, oh, the Moravian Church, as if it's one thing. But when
Mhm.
we parse the details, we see, oh, actually there was this one missionary named George Careys, and he had these ideas. And then there's another missionary who comes later, Christian Henry Rauch, and he had different ideas. So Careys was sort of a big tent kind of person, right? Like
Mm.
he would talk to people of African descent, Africans, and sort of learn about their practices, their beliefs. They had conversations about different names for God, for example. And and I think sometimes would integrate African religious practices into, his, Moravian services, oftentimes not really totally realizing it. So, there is a degree to which, again, spaces of correlation offers a way for there to be a very meaningful overlap between Africana religious traditions and Christianity, and this first missionaries really allowed those to flourish.
Hmm. And, you did identify, key correlations between Obeah and the Moravian Christianity. What were the four major points of overlap or tension?
Yeah, so there was baptism was a major one. And so I do think, like I was saying before, there was a water rituals, baptisms. There's many correlates, and also some Africans who'd been enslaved may have been Catholic, right? We know that the Kingdom of Congo was a Catholic at that point. Then we have the ritual, like burial practices, which I think are really important.
Yeah.
And then blood and wounds, the sort of this idea of healing. So like I was referring before to the way in which Moravian theology focuses greatly on blood and wounds. And so the way in which that also offered sort of a space of correlation. And so you see that there are these multiple ways in which the practices of this Moravian community were were not, again, one thing we tend to do is as sort of looking back or wanting to judge is so not we would talk about conversion if it's like turning
Mhm.
away from something and never looking back. And I think that's not really, the appropriate way to understand what's happening. These are accretive and overlapping ways of developing a religious community based on multiple religious practices and religious traditions. And I also, trace individuals. So the second chapter of the book looks at individuals who joins the Moravian Church. And, we don't know that much about them,
Yeah.
but what we do have from the records is sort of their name and also the African nation that they were associated with. And so that you can do a little bit of, I would call it informed speculation about, the religious traditions in a particular region and sort of how they may have been integrated into this community.
And I guess just going on to with baptism, so because baptism was very important ritual within the Moravian Church, how did baptism function spiritually and politically with enslaved communities?
So I think we can't know for sure exactly
Mhm.
how, like, what it meant to every single person. But one of the things that I argue is that it should be seen within the context of sort of Obia practice, right? So I think that there was a way in which it was an opportunity for divine protection. It can be an opportunity for, healing, and also a healing not just in sort of a physical sense, but in a sense of creating a new community after sort of such disruption and sort of oppression in sort of many of these people were who joins this Moravian community were born in Africa and enslaved, and these are creating new sacred communities is a way of, you know bringing together and sort of recreating something meaningful with other people that you find yourself surrounded by. So I think baptism was a way to sort of really gain access to this community that was increasingly meaningful to them. So, and I should also add that baptism, one perception we often have is that baptism was forced, in slave communities. And the opposite is the case here, that actually the missionaries who arrived were told to baptize very few people.
Mhm.
And this is for a lot of different political reasons. And the first missionary who arrived was just overwhelmed with the demands for baptism. And so, this is clearly an extremely desirable and meaningful experience that they want to participate in. And you see also that, one person is granted baptism, then they're trying to bring their families into the fold. So this is a way of really reinforcing the kinship networks and both sort of parents and children and siblings, but also sort of the relationships that you've developed over time. And so this was a new way to, right, recreate a sacred community.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you mentioned that, you titled your book Archival Eruptions. What does eruption mean in the context of colonial archives?
Yes, I know it's a very unusual word, and most people have never heard of it. And when I thought of it, I wasn't even sure if it was a real word, and kept looking it up, making sure that it was what I thought it was. So an eruption refers to a breaking through. And the idea here, there's two big arguments that I'm trying to make in this book.
Mhm,
One is about the meaning of Obia before it was criminalized. And the second is about how we can learn these things based on the colonial archives that are written almost exclusively by Europeans. So
mhm,
everything we know about Africans and people of African descent is being recorded not by them, but by enslavers, missionaries, colonial authorities whose objective is to control people and not to actually record their desires, their wants, their hopes, these are not records that exist. And so one overarching question for historians of this period is what can we do with these archives? How can we read them? Is it impossible to ever sort of tell Africana focused stories? And so the idea of an archival eruption came to me sort of it specifically with this reference to Obia, which appears in this missionary letter from 1755. And it is so strange, right? It is so unlike other references to Obia of the time or later. And it's also, I don't, the missionary who writes it down sort of knows what it is, but also doesn't completely understand what he's talking about. And so in this way, I think it represents this sort of disruption in the clean narrative that, missionaries are trying to present about, for this missionary, it would be, oh, I'm very successful, right? Like everything's going well. That's the objective of this letter. But then you have this reference to Obia that I think opens a door for us. So the eruption creates this crack in the sort of the the colonial narrative and
mhm,
allows us, if we focus on it, to tell a different story that isn't just reiterating sort of the objectives of the missionaries. And so that's the method, that's the philosophy that I bring to the archival documents that I'm working with. And and so, Obia is one example of an eruption. I also, look at other types of ruptures and disruptions that appear in the archive, whether it's two missionaries who have a diary, they say different things about an
mhm,
event, right? Like, or if it's just very carefully dissecting many references over time and figuring out like, oh, the name, like I have one chapter where it's about a maroon woman named Marjorie, which, and, just finding her name
mhm.
felt like a small miracle, right? And so it's a method and a way of reading that I think allows us to use colonial and missionary sources to different ends, right, than what they were intended for.
No, absolutely. And it's just a different way to kind of look at the same information just from a different lens. And, for yourself, what types of archives did you rely on? Was it just primarily just missionary letters and court records and legislative documents or personal diaries?
So the main body of archival sources that I was using were the Moravian missionary records, and those there are a lot of them, and so there's letters, there's diaries, there's church registers with baptismal records, there are accounts, there are right, so and then there are like meeting minutes.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of different things that you can kind of use them all, and then there are references to individuals, and then I would basically accumulate multiple references to individuals to be able to sort of tease out actual stories about people in the record, so people of African descent. And so that's some of the chapters focus on that. But in addition to the Moravian records, I was also looking at sort of the colonial records. So I look at the legal archive, and this includes sort of the 1760 law, but also previous laws in the British Atlantic world. I do a sort of an analysis of the way in which the law was used to try to basically support the system of slavery. And so the tactics that were used in the legal archive by colonial legislators in order to try to control enslaved people. And aside from that, I also use other travelers' records, kind of like a multiplicity of first person accounts of sort of the Caribbean, of Jamaica during this time period. One chapter I'm looking especially at the Thomas Thistlewood's papers, which are a set of diaries that were really kind of horrific in what they record, and they were actually written down just a few miles away from one of the Moravian mission stations. So,
Mhm.
looking at how different types of information that are recorded in different by different kinds of people. So there was really a wide variety. Oh, also printed sources. So,
Mhm.
pamphlets and other sources that were printed at the time. So, oh yeah, a lot of different, mostly missionary, but also colonial and legal sources.
No, thank you for that. That's always a good know to where and what documents can be used in terms of with your research. And what were some of the silences that you encountered in the archives? Like, where did the voices of African practitioners disappear or erupt unexpectedly?
Yes, I mean, the silences are everywhere,
Mhm.
right? So, and that is just something that we have to live with, right? That we are never going to recover everything that we want to recover from the past. And I, in order to sort of deal with this, I draw on the work of, other scholars. Michel Rolfe Chaillot is an anthropologist who wrote Silencing the Past, which was this really great analysis of how silences are produced in archives. And so I build on his work as well as people like Saidiya Hartman, who says that, we can also use our imaginations a little bit, like that actually we should, in order to to sort of help to fill in some of the silences. So, but where are silences? I mean, I think it's easier to say where they're not silences because
Mhm.
it's fewer. And so, for example, like with this chapter about Marjorie, right, the maroon woman, the things that I can find out are, that she was an early advocate of the Moravian Church, that she was, part of the Maroon community in Kampong Town, that we have descriptions of her devotion from the missionary. So like the you can gain some insight into why these ritual practices were meaningful to her. I she was as a maroon. I mean, I think that she was likely very closely associated with Obeah, not necessarily an Obeah woman, but I think that that's something we can't sort of say directly from the archives, but seems very likely. And then, you know, we can find out about the relationships that she had. And so one of the things I'm able to sort of discover with her story is, she was in a relationship with one of the enslaved men who was part of the Moravian community as well. And so you can track her movement over time and eventually sort of she I think I make the argument that the Moravian Church allows her to have more flexibility and mobility at a time when the colonial state was trying to really restrict the mobility of Maroons and not allow them to move across the land, but also that she initially was very excited about the Moravian Church and eventually seems to have distanced herself. So, you can, what the silence is like, why exactly? I have
Mhm.
speculations, but you can, again, we'll never really know. But I think, one thing is she had a child. I think part of it, did she really want to raise her child in the context of slave plantation? She eventually moves back to a Kampong town.
Mhm.
And so those are some of the stories that we can begin to tease out from these records by reading them, for eruptions, as I say, but the silences are still everywhere. I would love to know more about Marjorie and sort of,
Mhm.
what happened to her after she moved back to Compact Town. Like, like
Yeah.
what were the what I want to know more about what it meant to her to, associate with the Moravian Church and, how she thought about Obia. But, we can't, we just will
Yeah.
never know these things.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of the most, I guess, the most frustrating parts out of that. And for you, Professor Gerbner, how did you personally manage the emotional weight of reading these documents that have framed, African spirituality, life as criminal or demonic?
I mean, these records are tough, right? So
Yeah.
I think that this is just something, if you are a historian and you are doing work in this period, that's and you're asking these kinds of questions, that's just some part of that is part of the difficult aspect of this job.
Mhm.
And so, sometimes you need to take breaks, right? Like you need to,
Yes.
but I'll also say it's like it comes in waves, like I
Mhm.
think that you sometimes you're just sort of okay, like in the groove, reading archives, and then every once in a while, just something hits you. This is
Mhm.
a person, right? Like this is a life. Like these are
Yeah.
people, and that is where you really feel kind of yeah, just like
Yeah.
the tremendous horror and sadness of what people had to go through. And but then for me, that sort of renews a commitment to trying to tell stories, right? Like tell different stories, not let people be so, fully forgotten. So I think that it's sort of a it's a roller coaster, right? Like
Yes.
you go through different emotions. I think that, I've talked about this with other historians who
Mhm.
research in archives about, the archives of slavery. And we talk about sort of paying attention to our own sort of emotional
Yeah.
reactions. And I write a little bit about that in the book. But in the end, I think yeah, it's sort of I feel that being a historian is also sort of an ethical commitment to the
Mhm.
people that I'm studying. And so you work through the the difficulty of working with the records.
Yeah, I definitely could agree. I mean, I definitely agree with that because it's a lot of ups and downs, and of course, it's just trying not to take your own personal thoughts and processes and try to frame it in that time frame period, which is a challenge in and of itself, but it's just one of those things that you said to really respect in terms of that time frame period. Now, Professor Gerber, you discussed the figure Zacharias George Carey's. Who was he, and why was he such a disruptor within the missionary and colonial structures?
Yeah, so Zacharias George Carys, as I mentioned, was the first Moravian missionary to arrive in Jamaica. And his he was a disruptor in a lot of different ways. And his background was in kind of well, you mentioned the Great Awakening. He had been a revivalist preacher in England beforehand, and so they think that that legacy sort of meant that he was open to being a little bit. He was not as yeah institutional as some other missionaries would be, and I think that he cared a lot about just like the emotional meaning of these rituals of creating a community that felt really powerful. And so I think that he went into this experience kind of with those with that approach. And he did things that other European ministers and missionaries would not have done. I mean, he very much was focused on the enslaved and free Black communities. He was not, as I discuss in my first book,
Mhm.
Christian Slavery, there was almost no attention paid, and in fact, most enslaved people were excluded from Christian communities. So this was that itself is a sort of a
Mhm.
disruption and a strange thing to be doing that. The other ministers in the islands were very kind of distrustful of him. But the other things that he did, he tended to the sick, right? Like, so he did
Mhm.
things on a day-to-day basis that set him apart from other European figures. He also, I think, was dressed somewhat differently, but certainly behaved differently, and that people noticed that. And so I think that he was disruptive in Jamaica, and then he was disruptive within the Moravian Church because he because he embraced, he embraced sort of so many people and welcomed them into the community and baptized. As I was saying before, there was a lot of demand for baptism, and so he
Yes.
eventually agreed and baptized a number of people, and that was later seen as other church
Yes.
missionaries said it was too many people, and that he should have had stricter boundaries.
Yeah, definitely. And how did, enslaved and free Africans strategically kind of navigate both Obeah and Christianity?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, we can't access their sort of
Yeah.
interior lives, but I think that both of these were meaningful to people who joined the Afro-Moravian community. I think that baptism was understood within sort of the framework of Obia as a way to heal people, a way to bring people together, a way to purify and sacralize people, a community, a family, and so I think that they in those years in which there was sort of this overlap in this Afro-Moravian community between Obeah and Christianity, I think that they were understanding Christianity through a framework of Obia. I think then, once you have another missionary arriving who wants a stricter boundary, but then, sort of a dividing line, i- then I think that there are it's more difficult to navigate. And what you see is most people who had joined the community left in those years because of the new policies of this missionary Christian Henry Rauch, who I think was trying to align the mission with colonial law and with the colonial order, and not with Africana religious traditions and
Mhm.
sort of the desires of the community.
Absolutely. And, were there any moments where missionaries inadvertently empowered enslaved people, even as they tried to suppress, African spiritual authority?
So I think that they did. Well, and I think Carrie's, for example,
Hoped you enjoyed this episode,
was
and if you did, please
empowering
make sure to
people
like, follow,
partly
subscribe, and
by
write a review for the episode
perceiving
wherever
what
you
you might
listen to
call
your podcast.
African
Thank
spiritual
you.
authority within a framework of sort of as being aligned with his ideas of Christianity. But then there are other ways in which sort of the practice of the church was empowering enslaved people. So, I mean, I gave the example of Carries himself became sort of an advocate for enslaved people who were trying to, let's say they ran away for a couple days. He might sort of help them or speak for them. If someone fell ill and needed time away, he was just sort of acting as an intermediary between the attorney, overseers, and sort of enslaved people who are part of his community. So yes, so I do think that in ways that were both known and not known, missionaries could sort of empower enslaved people.
No, thank you. And then, what does the story, of course, of Obeah's criminalization teach us about how power defines acceptable spirituality?
Yeah, this is really a key point. I think it shows that what we consider to be legitimate legitimate Christianity, legitimate whatever it
Mhm.
is has a history, and that our perceptions have been influenced and defined by things that have happened in the past that we probably don't agree with, right? So I think that it's it is a reminder for us to think again about our perceptions and assumptions about particular practices, especially those that have been criminalized or demonized, and to think about why. Why do we have that perception? And if it's because that this practice was seen as powerful under slavery and it was criminalized for that reason, then I think we need to adjust our perceptions of that practice.
Absolutely. And I know this is, as we come to a close with this episode, and this next question goes towards, I think you touch a little bit on it, but it's basically how, if we were to look at present day Jamaica and of course the broader Caribbean, how do these 18th century constructions still shape attitudes towards African derived religions today?
I mean, I think that the fact that the Obia is still a crime on the books is pretty much all you need to know about that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's still this residue of badness, of sort of illegitimacy, of superstition, of that sort of is associated not with all African derived religions, but certainly some of them, and that is, it's not a surprise. We're all sort of shaped deeply by the past, and so again, I just think it's really important to learn what that past was, and then to reassess our present and see if we want to make any changes.
No, perfect. No, I wanted to, again, thank you so much for coming back on to the podcast to discuss your book, Archival Irruptions, because it kind of gives another blend, another layer to the whole discussion when it comes to the church and their impact during colonial times. So again, just wanted to thank you for coming on and giving your time for this. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Perfect.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.